It's time for another framework aside, where we talk about how some of the things we've been looking at are applied or used inside popular frameworks and libraries. Let's talk for a moment about something that JavaScript doesn't have that many other programming languages do and why it doesn't matter. This is function overloading. So again, I have a greet function. In other programming languages like C#, C++, Java, there's the idea of function overloading. What that means is I can have a function of the same name that has different numbers of parameters. Now, this doesn't really work in JavaScript because functions are objects. So that functionality isn't available in the way that JavaScript deals with functions. But that's okay because having first-class functions introduces a lot more options. But what if you did want to somehow have some alternatives for how you call the greet method? For example, what if I wanted to not always have to pass the language? Well, we've already seen that we could default the language and then have all our logic inside this function to decide what to do when the language is under different circumstances. So I could say, first of all, that we'll default to English if I don't get anything. And then if language is English, then let's just log to the console first name, or actually let's do hello, and then first name space last name. Let's just do that. And then if it's Spanish, we'll just do the same thing, but hola. We could make this code a bit better, but this is just for clarity to see what's going on. We have, in the case of language being English, it'll output one, and Spanish it's the other. And if I wanted to call this, I would put John Doe and then a language like English, or I could do John Doe Spanish. And then when I run this, I get my two function calls. But I might want a different version of this function where I don't have to pass as much information. Well, we can do that very easily by simply creating a different function with certain default parameters that will be passed to this greet function. For example, greet English. Let's say I create this function, and it will just take a first name and a last name. And then I can just call greet, pass first name, last name, and English. And then I can make another function called greet Spanish. And I'll pass Spanish, and I'll call this same core greet function that has all my logic. And then when I want to call these, instead of always having to think about which language I'm passing, I can just call a different function, which then passes for me my intended parameter value. See how that works? So these look the same. They call the same greet function inside of them, but I'm by default passing a certain parameter value. This is one approach to dealing with having simpler function calls. There's another we'll see later on. But just remember, if you're coming from another programming language and you're worried about function overloading, don't. There are other patterns, and in some ways patterns that are better in JavaScript that we'll see as we go along because we have first-class functions. All right. This is just one pattern, and a very simple one. But we understand that within JavaScript frameworks and libraries, you'll see this kind of pattern on occasion to make it easier to use the library or framework because it's very clear what it's doing. All right, let's move on.